Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll start in a couple of minutes.
Terrific.
Take it out of mine. Shane? Take it out of Shane.
No, I didn't know all.
Okay, no, leave it till we're about to start. I'll introduce you. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, they are. So I'm like, like it's like so there's obviously we move now. Like if we have
Smoky Dawson
we might get started. Judith, if you can finish with your selfies, that'd be great. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending this evening. And before I introduce the people who've really come to listen to, I'll take the opportunity to just explain who we are. I know I've met some of you, and I appreciate the ongoing support that you give us. But LibertyWorks is a free market do tank. We try to bring together people of like mind to discuss issues, and we're great advocates of free speech, so debate is good. One of the things with this particular issue is that the truth sometimes is sadly missing from many of the debates that we see that go on. And the left and the right on this particular issue have an agenda that sometimes doesn't equate to what is actually going on in the ground. And we're fortunate here to have someone who's brave enough and has facts on hand to expose what's actually going on. And we also have one of the few journalists in the country that's also prepared to talk about these sort of issues. For no further ado, I might introduce Miranda Devine. Now, many of you, everyone here knows Miranda, of course. But Miranda, I noticed in your book that at the end, the last sentence of your foreword, you said that Coates's book, and I quote, is a valuable contribution to one of the most contentious debates in Australia's history. My question to you is why?
Thank you, and thank you all of you for coming here. I'll just make sure I get this thing on. Hello? Yes. So why is it an important book? Manus Island has been a sort of a touchstone, symbolic issue for refugee activists and Greens and human rights lawyers and compassionistas for 15 years or more. And just yesterday we saw them trying to hijack Anzac Day by twisting the well-known motto, lest we forget, into lest we forget Manus Island. And if you don't think too deeply or you don't know anything, then your heartstrings are tugged by the fact that there are still 600 men on Manus Island who've been there for many years, and the refugee activists will tell you that they've been living in a gulag and a concentration camp, and that Peter Dutton is a Nazi and a murderer and an evil person with blood on his hands. And there's never really any counter-narrative. And, you know, it's important not to trust what the government says, what any government says, but we've been offered just a very polarised version of what goes on in offshore processing, because few reporters, if any, manage to get to these places, and we are just told the government's view, or we're told the activists' view. And they have lied and used hyperbole and exaggeration for so long that anything they say you have to dismiss because they're not trustworthy. And that leaves us in a rather unfortunate position where the only alternative we have is to accept everything the government says, which is not great either. And that's why Michael's book is so important, because he's come at it not as someone with an axe to grind. He just was an ex-soldier who answered an ad for a job. And he went there along with a whole lot of other ex-service people and security guards and so on, to not knowing what to expect and with no political motivation. And he's just recorded what he saw. And, you know, there are things for both sides that they will find uncomfortable in the book, because he talks about people who, you know, certainly from his observation, really were genuinely people in need. He didn't really know their backstory, but they seemed genuine. They seemed like they could have been real refugees. They're certainly from war-torn areas. But then there was a whole swag of other people who were the loudest, who were the ones that made the most inroads with the activists, who lied, who were Iranian middle-class party boys, who, as he writes in the book so eloquently, everybody on Manus Island was escaping from something. And the reason it's important is because last time the activists' lies and hyperbole was believed was when Kevin Rudd was in power, and his moral vanity and the pressure from the refugee activists meant that he dismantled the very hard-won Howard government border protection policies. If you remember, it was John Howard who first started up Manus Island as an offshore processing centre in 2001, when the boats were stopped the first time. And I think the last person left Manus Island in 2004. And then, of course, Kevin Rudd comes in, the Oceanic Viking catastrophe happens where he just buckles. And before you know it, the people smugglers are back in business. 50,000 unauthorised boat arrivals come here. They overwhelm our border security apparatus. 1,200 people at least were drowned at sea. And the people smugglers preyed on most of these people, took their life savings, promised them the world. And then, of course, when the music stopped and Kevin Rudd realised that to win an election in 2012, 3 years after he sort of opened the floodgates again, Kevin Rudd decides before an election that he's going to announce that offshore processing is back in business on Manus Island. The Abbott government came in, they stopped the boats, and now it's up to the Turnbull government to try and clean up the human tragedy that's left behind. And that means, you know, they've been trying to, with this American deal with Donald Trump that began with Obama, they've managed to get a few hundred of these single men off Manus Island, and there are still, as I said, 600 left, and somehow they either need to go home or, which they're offered quite substantial sums to do. They think that they can wait out the government. Probably if the Labor Party wins the next election, they will manage to make it to Australia. They will have been rewarded, and the people smuggler business will be back in business. But all of that's politics, and what Michael has written is not about politics. He's just told the simple story of his observation from his years of working at Manus Island. The good, the bad, the ugly. He puts into perspective how the locals feel about this influx of single men from foreign cultures coming into the middle of their very traditional family-oriented society. The drugs, the sex, the issues that these men have sort of transplanted into their community has not been fun, no matter how much money our government has spent. So it's all a bit of a mess, sort of necessary because of what Kevin Rudd did, but the only way we can actually sort out what to do about it and how to prevent it happening again is if we know the facts on the ground, and that's where Michael comes in.
Yep. Thank you so much for that. Okay. First up, I want to say thanks to everyone for coming along tonight. Thanks to LibertyWorks. Not for that. Thanks to LibertyWorks for setting up, and to the Metropolitan for having us here. But first up, everyone, I want to tell you what this presentation is not going to be. It's not going to be a full story of my time on Manus Island, or even really the half of it. That's mainly because I've got a book I'm trying to flog off, and no one gets anything for free. So, yeah, but is that off? Is that on? It's on. Okay. So, and like I said, it's not going to be the full story of my time there, or even really the half of it, but I just wanted to give you a little indication of what I was trying to get at when I went ahead with this project. What I want to start with, though, is a brief outline of what I like to call the revised definitions that I came up with while I was on the island. So you can more accurately understand the story of Manus Island through the eyes of a hardcore refugee activist. Now, first up is the definition of detention. Forget what you think that word means. Detention now means that you're not actually detained in a place. It means that you're accommodated with everything that you need provided for an amount of time until you choose to leave. When you do choose to leave, you are given free flights by the Australian government and spending money, anywhere up to about $20,000 depending where you're actually going to. Now, the only stipulation that goes with this payment and these flights is that you can then not illegally re-enter Australia with falsified documents or no documents at all. This is no different to any other country in the world. Now, the second term I want to redefine for you is hunger strike. Now, please don't be distressed. I don't think that's working, is it?
It's not now.
Okay, don't worry about it. I'll be right.
Stick with it.
Can everyone hear me, anyone?
No,
This one works, just use this one here. Okay.
Is that?
Okay.
Now? Okay. If you didn't hear what I said before, it was awesome and you've missed out. Okay. The second thing I want to redefine here is hunger strikes. Now, I don't want you to be distressed when you hear the word hunger strike, because on Manus Island, hunger striking doesn't mean you actually don't eat, because that takes way too long and becomes very uncomfortable when you're trying to achieve a political goal. You can't mount a choreographed and emotionally manipulative media campaign when you're hungry. It's just not effective. Now, I want you to finally readjust the way you think of the word or the phrase non-violent, because when you conduct a non-violent protest on Manus Island, you can still swing a metal bar at my head, you can still throw Bessebrocks at me, you can still make homemade capsicum spray to try and throw in my face. As long as you have plenty of footage of yourself beforehand looking really sad and holding up signs and getting a hashtag campaign going, because as soon as you do that, it's no longer violent. Now, get that out of the way. A little bit about myself and how I ended up in Manus Island. And first up, I'll say just about everyone's got an opinion on this country's policy of offshore immigration processing, and it might not be a really strong opinion, and people might not even really say what their opinion is unless you ask them, unless they're like a vegan or a really hardcore activist, and then they'll tell you everything they think about it. But a lot of them don't have it really based on any genuine first-hand experience, and until the day I rocked up on Manus Island for the first time, I was exactly the same as all of those people. All I knew was what I saw on TV, maybe read in the paper every now and then, but didn't really care that much about the whole issue. And for something that's got so little impact on our everyday lives, I find it funny how emotive people actually get about it. So, and I reckon that's to do with just our society these days. We've got the internet, we've got so many channels on TV, it's easy to think that we are, well no, we are a lot better informed than anyone ever used to be, but we're not maybe as well informed as we like to think that we might be. So, and it's easy to have an opinion on something when it doesn't directly affect you and when the consequences aren't yours to deal with. So some people see it as a deeply moral and emotional issue, and others see it as just pragmatic and practical. You know, whether it depends what you think's right, whether it's the fair go or whether it's due diligence and actually looking at something that's going on and how it's going to affect you and your society. But like I said, one thing that most either activists or opponents have in common is that most of their views are largely academic, and I was the same as all of them. So how did I become part of this whole mess, really? It was the reason I wanted to work in the centre there had nothing to do with politics and nothing to do with my thoughts on any of their morality or something. My motivation is money, and the money was actually really, really good. That was something I was looking at, because at the time I'd left the Australian Army. I'd spent 6 months backpacking overseas. You know, I rented a car with a few of my mates and drove through America for about 6 months, and then I headed off to South Africa. And I had this big plan there of getting work with an anti-poaching unit. So I thought, yeah, this is cool, it's a good cause, and I can use my skills. And then I discovered like Cape Town and all the beaches and bars there, and ended up living in a house with a heap of Scandinavian backpackers for about 6 months, and nothing else got done. So I came home to Australia. It was like, I've got to actually get a job now, go back into the real world and sort of grow up. I've had my gap year at 27, but yeah, I've done all that, and now I've got to actually grow up and get a real job. That's when, who would have thought that Julia Gillard would have actually saved me on that, in that respect, because this was about the time that Julia Gillard had, or Labor had reset the policy, like I said, of the offshore immigration processing to deal with the influx of the illegal entries after the Labor government had dismantled the Howard government's policy of offshore processing. So I came home and looking around, I noticed on Facebook of all places that a lot of my mates were now checking into like the airport a lot, and were in these really exotic sounding place names that I hadn't heard of. So I made a few calls and said, oh, what are you guys up to? And they said, we're in Nauru, or we're in New Guinea. And so they'd set up these process centres again, they've been reopened. And I made a call, they gave me an email, just said, if you're interested, call this number. Called the number, got told, yeah, we're glad to hear from you, but we've got enough people on our books at the moment, so don't call us, we'll call you. Thought nothing more of it. Then a few months later, at like 11:30 on a Saturday night, someone rang me up and said, can you come into our office tomorrow? And I thought, oh, okay. Wow, got in there, walked into this office that was complete chaos. There was like paper all over the floor, stuff happening everywhere, a TV with a light on it was like on the wall, there was this poor, like, temp agency admin girl who was about 17 working at the desk who was having a nervous breakdown with everything that was going on, and some guy who seemed to be in charge ran out and said, "Can you go tonight?" And I was like, "Okay, no. But, yeah, like, I'll go, like, next week or something. I've got to make a few arrangements." He goes, "Oh, yeah, it's okay, man. It's, I know it's short notice." So I went home and he rang me again and said, "No, can you go tonight? Like, tomorrow maybe." I was like, "Okay." So this is... Basically, I got on that plane, and that was me for the next 3 years, on and off, on the Manus Island. So that's how quickly this whole thing started, and pretty much sums up what the next couple of years of my life were like. So it was, like I said before, it was one of those funny policy backflips that I guess politics are famous for. You had one side of politics, and the funny thing I found is that, like, when you got the Liberal Party and the Labor Party, they both basically do the same thing when they're in office. It's only when they're in opposition that they complain about what the other one's doing. So the whole time we're there, everyone's complaining about Tony Abbott, but they don't realise that, well, and they do realise it, they just don't want to say that Tony Abbott didn't do this. He's kept it going, but the Labor Party started beforehand. So all your graffiti on the walls, that was all over the centre about Tony Abbott, Tony Abbott, Tony Abbott. Tony Abbott didn't start this. So, and that's why I've got this quote here. That was actually the date that lived in infamy there, that was on all the graffiti, was 19 July 2013. That was the date that Kevin Rudd actually said this. And he said, "From now on, any asylum seeker who arrives in Australia by boat will have no chance of being settled in Australia as refugees. Asylum seekers taken to Christmas Island, which was an Australian territory, will be sent to Manus and elsewhere in Papua New Guinea for assessment for their refugee status. If they found to be genuine refugees, they'll be resettled in Papua New Guinea. If they are found not to be genuine refugees, they may be repatriated to their country of origin or be sent to a safe third country other than Australia." So, straight away there was where it started for me, because I got there and the whole thing was being blamed on someone who came into power 6 months after this was said by someone else, which I found like the first thing that threw me about the whole situation to get there. And, the media always got a lot of mileage, I thought, out of 10 years before that. You had John Howard made that famous quote, "The whole world decide who comes to this country and circumstances in which they came." So I always wondered whether they made, I was too young to sort of remember that at the time in any meaningful way, but I wondered whether they made the same deal out of that at the time that they did Kevin Rudd's words. So, I'll just give you just a bit of background into how the centres reopened. Now, when the centres were, I'm talking about Nauru and Manus Island, when they were both reopened in 2013, the facilities there had been dormant since the decade before, when the Howard government's system had been in place. And even by reopening them, they weren't up to the standard or the size required for the influx that had since arrived. So when they were reopened, the first people sent to both islands to get these facilities up and running again was actually the Australian Defence Force. We'd sent in engineering units to get all the basic logistic stuff and the amenities such as plumbing, electricity, all that sort of thing up and working again. As soon as that was up and running, the army ships up, goes home, and the government does what they seem to do really good when there's some random job comes up and they don't really know how to deal with it, they just outsource it. Now, a large logistics conglomerate called Transfield got the contract for this. Now, anyone who's ever worked with the Defence Force or a lot of big government agencies might be familiar with this organisation. They run a lot of the garrison services on a lot of defence bases, so they're in charge of, say, accommodation, upkeep, a lot of catering, maintenance, even random stuff on some bases like firefighters and stuff they had there that are contracted through Transfield. So they were pretty well versed in setting up this sort of organisation. When they had to get certain other things, such as, say, catering, medical services and security set up, they subcontracted out to other contractors. That's where we came in. We were contracted through a company called Wilson, which is and isn't related to the logos you might see around the city here tonight. It was actually a separate offshore holding that was set up specifically for this, and that's how I came on board with that. They recruited mainly, and it was all run out of Brisbane, so it was all run and recruited mainly from the sizable, like ex-military and law enforcement community that was residing in Brisbane. Very much a who you know sort of gig where people just called up their mates and we all sort of came on board and were just dropped into this location and were told to set this process up from scratch basically. So the first thing I remember noticing that led me to really realise how much the media was skewing the situation was when we got off the plane at Mamoti Airport, which is Manus Island's main airport. There was a sign above the terminal there that said something to the effect of "Welcome to Manus Island, our tropical paradise." Now this is an old tourism sign; it's been there for decades. But I always used to see this photo of this sign on articles about how horrible Manus Island was, like this was set up as some sort of joke. It's like you've taken the photo of the airport welcome sign and skewed this to be something that's not. And then the first time I saw buildings that I recognised, I hadn't ever been there, but I drove past these buildings which I sort of recognised. It was the old PNG naval housing, which had been abandoned in the 70s and overgrown by jungle. And to this day, I still see these photos depicted as being the transferees' accommodation on Manus Island, when in reality it's miles up the road and it's an abandoned housing estate which no one lives in, except the local vagrants and children that play there and stuff like that. So straight away, I was seeing that something, what was being depicted in the media at home wasn't exactly the reality of what was the life on the ground here. So, got a few pages double up here, that's why I'm flicking through it, but okay, so that was when this, and over the next couple of years, we started to see a complete disconnect between the media portrayal of what was happening on the islands and what we were experiencing on the ground. A lot of this I don't actually blame on the media themselves because they weren't there and were simply using what image came up on Google Images and just kept rehashing the same image over and over again. And it suited activists to not challenge this narrative because it made it look the way that suited their narrative that they were pushing here. And I want to talk to you more about this later, but I'd like to do it just actually chatting with you because I prefer talking with people than just talking at you like I'm doing now. But I'll finish with saying that last year, I'd left the centre by then, but last year I watched the last days of the centre there unfolding on TV, like I'm sure maybe many of you did. But the funny thing about it for me was that I was able to see things that the average viewer is not able to say, pick up on, just little nuances of watching this footage when you're watching a place that you know intimately, including in one case your own office that you used to work out of, which a guy is now sleeping in, saying that this is his accommodation. But I saw things like, you may remember a man giving a impassioned and well-articulated speech. But this was the same man who, for the last 3 years I've known him, had presented to me the persona of being a brain-damaged fool who couldn't communicate with anyone, who was now the mouthpiece of this organisation giving these speeches. So he made a remarkable recovery in my few months that I didn't see him. I also remember the forlorn man holding up a sign denouncing his criminal treatment at the hands of the Australian government and reminding them that they had a responsibility to care for him. This was the same man whose room I'd had to search following a riot and saw for the first time with my own eyes what child pornography looks like. This was also the same man I then had to follow through the local town of Lorengau on his days that he went shopping to make sure he didn't come into contact with any local children. But obviously the way of doing this, because you couldn't stop him talking to anyone because that was infringing on his rights, the way I had to do this was by harassing the local children to stay away from me because I was near them. And these are the people that refugee advocates put up as their spokespeople on this island. And those activists always like to say that if you met these men and listened to their stories, then you could not help but want to bring them here to Australia. They even had a hashtag about it, bring them here. These activists, the majority of them, have never been anywhere near Manus Island. They've not spent days with these men and seen them in their unguarded selves, because anyone can present a filtered and constructed version of themselves on the internet, and internet dating has shown us that. And for a lot of these activists, the lines there between internet dating and activism were actually very, very blurred. So, yeah, that was something that just goes to show that talk is really cheap in those regards. But a lot of words are spoken on Manus Island about who was in the wrong and who was responsible. So when it comes down to it, I can only judge a person by how they behave around me. And that's the only way we can ever really judge anyone. And anyone who says anything different, I believe, is just kidding themselves. But I saw behaviour from asylum seekers / refugees, depending what they were at the time, due to their determinations, that absolutely sickened me. And I'm not talking about just the violence and the sexual assaults and their treatment of the local people there, but their manipulation of well-meaning but naive people back in Australia who seemed so desperate to believe what it was that they were being told. Now, these are the same compassionate folks in Australia that set up harassment and hate pages targeting myself and my colleagues, posting photos of homes, families, holidays, and then stuff about, blood money, we know where you live, blah, 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 whatever. And, lucky for us, most of these advocates don't get out from behind their computers, so we didn't have much to worry about. But it just goes to show the sort of person that will go to those levels to control the narrative that they believe in. And that's not to say I didn't see a lot of people there that I felt extremely sorry for. I didn't know what their individual stories were beyond just random conversation day to day, and it wasn't my job to know that. But the actions I saw from those people was that of just dignified people that were in a bad situation, that had been sold a lie by a criminal enterprise, and they were now basically paying the price for engaging in that criminal activity that they may or may not have realised, the gravity of what they were getting into. But they were doing their best to get through it. Those aren't the people that you saw in all the videos on the internet and in the media. Those people were never in front of the cameras making a scene. They were the people who just got on with their day-to-day life as best they could. The people that you saw in front of the cameras were the ones that caused the riots, that manipulated that system and put those other people at risk to the point of endangering them deliberately in order to prove a point, really. But most will have to say that the people that were the most impacted by this whole situation were the local people on Manus Island. And despite my frustration with them at times, the Manusians are really warm and dignified people. If anyone's ever thinking of going there on a holiday, which you can actually do, is a massive tropical island with heaps of awesome diving and fishing and stuff like that, and World War II history if you're into that, I recommend going there because these people will put you up and show you an awesome time around their island. And they've had this massive opportunity given to them by all this stuff being there, but also a massive upheaval that's really affected their society there. And it will be for years to come, and I hope they can make something of it, but unfortunately I think the only people that will benefit from it are a few of the people at the top, really, because you probably heard about how bad corruption in Papua New Guinea is, and it's alive and well on Manus Island. But the thing that annoyed me most about that was that these activists, through all their histrionics and everything from their transfer service, have completely demonised the local people there to make them out to be some sort of wild, dangerous savages that are out to kill them for no reason. Now, there's definitely truth in their claim that a lot of the locals are hostile towards them. That's after several years, though, of really bad, not only crime in the local community, but provocation of the local community, and so forth. So it doesn't matter where you've come from and what you've been through, you don't treat your hosts like that, regardless of why you are there and why you believe you should or shouldn't be there. So, however this is judged by history, and I can assume there won't be like a consensus on that. But I've got no guilt personally or regrets about anything I did there, and I don't know anyone who does. So I don't know really whether offshore processing is the long-term solution to this. Well, it won't be a long-term solution because all they've got to do is wait till everyone's gone. And a lot of them have left voluntarily, and a lot of them will leave eventually voluntarily. But who I do have a problem with is the activists who judge from a distance and they assign the status of good and evil of two groups of people they have not met, but are so confident in what their assertions on this are. So, yeah, and I've met these activists, but the funny thing is they haven't met me because they don't actually know who I am when I talk to them. And it's always funny to hear stories about what I've done in my day-to-day life from people I've never met and haven't been anywhere near me. So I want to leave it there because I didn't really want to stand here and talk to people. So if anyone does want to talk about anything, I'd love to talk to you guys about this, but I didn't just want to talk to people for now, so I'll leave it there. But thanks for
Both Michael and Miranda will be taking questions. I was hoping to have this working, but it's not, so use a big
Loud voice.
loud voice. Thank you.
Miranda used the phrase Iranian playboys. Would you like to comment on that? Is that a fair description of the 400 men?
I can't say all 400, but the ones that every day I would come in front. Have you ever seen the show Jersey Shore? Imagine that. That's how they act. I got the impression after a while, a lot of the Iranians there were from. Iran's not an impoverished country. You know, it's a dodgy country, but it's not impoverished by any means. A lot of the guys that had the resources to be where they were, as in not on Manus, but in a position to be intercepted to be on Manus, means they were in Indonesia or Thailand beforehand, were from highly educated middle-class backgrounds. So a lot of them talking, I had the opportunity because speaking with people like myself and my colleagues, it wasn't like they were speaking with, say, caseworkers or immigration officers where they had to cultivate a persona. Whatever they said to me had no bearing. So I felt that maybe we were getting a more sort of honest or unguarded sort of look into their lives. A lot of the stories I kept getting from these blokes was they'd been in trouble with the law back home, whether it was through drugs, stuff that wasn't allowed so openly in Australian society. Iranian society, which is what they left from. Then they make their way to Thailand and Bali, where they're surrounded by West, and like we all know what like Westerners are like when they go to places like Thailand. It's just one big party of excess. They see that and they go, well, we can go to the West and this is just how it is. And they're like, oh, I can do all the things I couldn't do openly back there that I was in trouble for. Like one example being, like you told me that he had to leave Iran because the police were constantly harassing him and his family. Oh wow, why? He goes, oh, I was selling drugs at uni. I'm like, oh, okay. And straight away you start getting this story out of the Iranians in particular. But the Iranians were because they were the most highly educated and obviously spoke the best English. They were the stories that we got the most because we could converse the most easily with them. But by the same token, they were the ones that could easily converse with the advocates and could then show their version of what they wanted people to see about them. And that wasn't the same as what we got. Anyway.
Yeah.
I realise that your answer's probably going to be anecdotal, but it's really difficult to get any information about the 50,000 people who came through. Well, obviously they didn't all go through Manus. Manus was the sort of worst of the worst. But to this day, we still have no information about how many of the 50,000 so-called refugees or illegal immigrants, whatever you want to call them, ended up in Australia. How long it took them to get residency, how many of their family members they brought over, that kind of information. So, just anecdotally, could you give us some insight into that?
Yeah, or from from stuff that's like readily available. I would guess that, I don't know the numbers, but anyone who came before the July 13 deadline could theoretically be in Australia now, because that's when the deadline came in. They said, no, if you've come by boat, no matter what, bang, this is it. To the point where a lot of the, it was, funny's not the right word, but like, a lot of the guys, it was just like, yeah, just chance really. A lot of the guys that were on Manus could have been in Australia, they just literally missed the boat. As in, a lot of them spoke about they had friends who they were with in Thailand who were like, we're going to get on the boat today. They said, no, full moon parties next week, I'm staying for that. So their friends are in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, whatever, and they were on Manus and they were pissed off about it because they missed that cut-off. And a lot of them, when they call home and they say that they're in Sydney and that because they're ashamed to admit that they got caught up in the whole situation. But I do believe, yeah, a lot from like the previous incarnations of the whole system. I think there are probably a lot. I'm sure that, and I think that information will be available. I just haven't bothered to look because
I
it's
think
not
that's right.
interesting.
I think almost all those 50,000
A lot are.
It's settled.
Yeah, they weren't on Manus because they were like some bad category. They were literally the ones that got intercepted after that deadline. And once they were there, and like it took a few months, but once I don't think there's been a vote since then that we know of.
So Miranda, do you have any official figures?
Well, I mean, between July 2013 and September 2013, whatever numbers came in that period, you can subtract from the 50,000. But before that, everybody who arrived, which I think the floodgates started, I think, around 2009. So for those 3.5, well, November 2009 to July 2013, so for that period, that, 50,000 I think is a conservative estimate that we got from the Abbott government when they came in, really. But the billions of dollars that it cost to, those people were fast-track processed, and just, there was no way of dealing with them because the border control had just been completely torn apart. All the suite of measures that Philip Ruddock and John Howard had put together. So those 50,000 would be living, who knows where, but probably in southwestern Sydney. And, big majority of them were Muslims from, Iraq, Afghanistan, perhaps, and Iran, a lot of Iranians. Now, and many of them would have been genuine refugees. I mean, people from Afghanistan, you can't say that the people, that was a war-torn country. So perhaps they do justify.
They're not genuine refugees if they haven't claimed refugee first.
Well, that's right. And I mean, technically, they're not. None of them are refugees because they're country hopped. But when I say genuine refugees, I mean they can't go home. They're different from the Iranian party boys. So I think there were gradations of need in there, and then there were some Tamils and so on. So
and a lot of those Iranians, a lot of those Iranians did go home. There's a reason now where you see the number 600 instead of 1,500 that were at the start. And at least once a week, a bus would be going to the airport with guys that were going home. And I'd see ones that I knew. I said, "Oh, so you're telling me you couldn't go home? Oh, the guy I owed money to died, or Dad sorted that thing out." Other people, who knows about going back to, but I still get Facebook requests from someone from back in Iran and stuff.
So that 50,000 would be here. But we have a very generous refugee program anyway. And so what really happened was that the offshore refugees, the people in the UN camps, or the people who were genuine refugees who've been forced out of their homes and had nowhere else to go, who we otherwise would have prioritised, they just missed out. So one of the good things about stopping the boats and getting control of our borders has been that we've been able to fill those refugee places with genuine refugees. And that's why I don't understand the logic of the refugee activists. They're not really refugee activists, they're open border ideologues, because if they actually cared about people who have been persecuted and forced out of their homes, then they would want an orderly process.
Yeah. I notice there's a big difference between persecution and prosecution. Because you hear a lot about using the Thailand analogy again. I know for a fact there's a lot of Australians over there.
Sorry guys, I know there's a lot of Australians that say live in Thailand because they've done stuff here that, you know, is not well liked, and they're living over there. So you got to look at those channels they came through, and obviously most of my opinions were based on the people I was able to talk to, but they were the ones that were able to give. And the funny thing about the Iranians being is that, like, in a way, you actually had a lot in common with them, because they almost, even though they're living in their theocracy or whatever they live under, they had a very Western outlook on a lot of things, and so you could have a lot in common with them. And their rationale, or the way they justified the system in their own mind was just more of a, well, I should be able to do what I want, because they come from society, especially being, you know, the middle to upper class and males in that society. They're not used to getting not their own way. It's, I'm entitled to this, I should be able to just do this if I want to, and they just didn't realise that things didn't work that way. So that was what, a lot of the problems we had with the Iranians was that situation there.
So, middle class, party hard, educated, how would they fit on the spectrum of maybe they come in and work and fit in society well, and potential jihadists?
Well, yeah. I wouldn't say jihad at all. I wouldn't. Anyone, whenever people go, oh, you know, it'll be full of terrorists, or whatever, that'd be almost giving them too much credit. Like, you know, if a terrorist organisation is trying to get into Australia, what they don't need to sneak in through frigging boats. They can come in legally. They can cultivate. Yeah, they don't need to do it. Yeah, it's so. I don't think there was any terrorist in there amongst them. But as far as and that's probably one of the annoying things about them, was that, like, some of them, or maybe a lot of them, even though they were unlikable people to me, probably could have made a decent life of it in Australia if they had decided to come through it, and to come through it through the genuine channels. And people say there isn't any, but I know for a fact there is, because I've seen these embassies in these countries that I've been through that they could have applied at. So, but yeah, they definitely could have, and like a lot of Iranian descent people in Australia have made a great go of it, and they could have done it, but because they made that choice to circumnavigate the system like they did, they ended up in the situation they were. And you'd hear about their adventures, I'd call it, in the 3 or 4 countries they'd passed through, and they seemed to have similar stories of being persecuted wherever they were. And I just started to think about these individuals themselves. Have you ever heard the saying, like, you know, when you meet someone who complains that all day they've just met arseholes all day, it's like, well, maybe it's you. So maybe you're the problem. So that's just the opinion I started to form of a lot of them now.
What percentage of the refugees you reckon were genuine, and what percentage would be basically no-hopers who would never really contribute to Australian society?
I don't know that you could call him, because to be able to get the resources to go, they've had to be there in the first place. Like, it's quite a fair bit of money and contacts that they need to cultivate. Even though a lot of them, I'd say, from maybe less privileged, educated backgrounds, the Iranians particularly. The Iranians, I've got no doubt, knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that what they were doing was illegal, but after all, the last few years, it had been, you knew that would work. You knew you'd get intercepted on the boat, and they all knew that, and that was, getting intercepted was the plan. Like, the plan wasn't to try and get past the Border Patrol. The plan always is to be intercepted. That's why I'll head to the channels that between Indonesia and northwest Australia, the shortest point, because these tiny boats can't go through the open ocean, obviously. They all head to those channels where they know they'll be surveillanced and intercepted, because what else are they going to do? Land in remote northwest Australia and die on the beach because there's no one there. Right? So they knew the plan was to get intercepted, brought to Australia. As it had gone on in years past, they'd do a few months in detention on the Australian mainland and then get processed into the community. So they were, and that was what the people smugglers sold to them, because that had been the reality of the last few years. It was only when the July 13 proclamation came in, the people smugglers had that ripped out from underneath them, which pretty much killed their business. And these guys had been the unlucky ones left holding the pot, basically, and they weren't happy about it, and they made that quite known. But as for, like, the genuine refugees, like, going back again to the communication thing, because there was other races there I couldn't communicate with as much, you didn't get as much of their story. I knew a lot, say the Afghans that we had there were all from the northern Hazara ethnicity in Afghanistan, which are like, if you ever seen like Mongolians and more Asiatic looking people, that's who they were. They weren't like the Pashtun, Pakistani sort of Taliban that you'd associate with Afghanistan. So these guys have, probably had quite a fair hard time over the last few years at the hands of the Taliban and the Pashtuns in their country, but it didn't change the fact that they'd been either engaged the people smugglers or had been probably duped by the people smugglers in a lot of ways to saying, yeah, this is the way to go, and ended up where they were. So for a lot of those guys, they could have been quite genuine. I'm sure a lot of them are there. But when a proclamation like that was made, I guess the government can't just start picking and choosing. It's got to be this small number of people now are bang, and we haven't seen any more boats since then, so I guess it fulfilled the aim that they were going with that. So that's all I could sort of guess at, really. Yeah.
I've got a question for Miranda. So we know it's a contentious issue for most Australians, but in the media bubble, just how polarised is it?
Well, I worked at Fairfax for 10 years, and it was really from 2001 on, so that was the height of this people smuggling influx, and it just felt like the entire newsroom, or at least not the entire newsroom, but the culture, the Fairfax culture, was to swallow everything that the activists said, not apply any basic journalistic due diligence to it. Partly that was because the government was so secretive and would never allow any journalists to go to Nauru or Manus Island. But I think the media just exaggerated and inflated the refugee activists' stories, and just made the whole thing worse. It just, and that rewarded the activists for telling untruths. It rewarded the asylum seekers, encouraged them to, stage protests, to take their mouths shut, to sew their lips together, to have hunger strikes, all this stuff to create mayhem in the detention centres. And this was just this continual loop, and the essence of it was to malign the Australian, Australia, to say that we are nothing better than Nazis and concentration camp runners and so on. So I think the media was just as culpable, and particularly, they're still doing it. The left-wing media is still running around, encouraging activists like what's her name, Abdul Majid and Catherine Devaney, all these people, to propagate this idea that Manus Island is a gulag. And last year you saw where the gulag, so-called gulag, the detention centre, was closed down. New accommodation had been built on the island for the remaining asylum seekers. And they're free to do what they want. They're free to have jobs, they're free to go home, to be paid by the government to go home. They're not in any gulag, and yet that was even worse. Now they complained, the refugee activists and the media complained about the gulag shut, and they're still complaining. It's even worse now that the gulag shut. So I just think it's actually become a narrative for the media, and there are activists, journalists in the media who work for, The Guardian and BuzzFeed and all the myriad of left-wing publications, and they won't let up. And so I think that's why it's quite, even though Labor has this very strong policy that they're not going to open the borders again, and Bill Shorten knows that that's an election loser for him. So even Anthony Albanese and the left of the party, which want open borders, they're keeping mum about it. But I just think that as soon as Labor gets in, it'll be just like with Kevin Rudd, the pressure from the media and from everybody to get them to soften the border protection policies will be on. And the problem with that is the people smugglers will also be expecting that when Labor comes in, things will be softer. So they will then put
pressure, send boats, test the resolve of Labor. And this will be a big flashpoint. The media is waiting for that to happen, so they will amplify it. And, part of the way that John Howard managed to stop the boats, and if you remember Scott Morrison and Angus Campbell managed to stop the boats, was by being actually quite secretive, which goes against the grain for journalists. But remember those press conferences that Scott Morrison and Angus Campbell used to hold, and they talk about, no, this is an on-water matter. They were farcical press conferences because there was no information coming out. The media got very frustrated, etc., etc. But it was only with that sort of veil of secrecy that they could send out those orange lifeboats and turn boats back and do all that. And stop the people smuggling business, because the war is not against the asylum seekers, whether they're fraudulent or not. The war is against these criminal people smuggler gangs that prey on chances or genuinely people in need, get huge amounts of money from them, and they're very clever at testing all our weak points. They've now had 2 goes at it, and the next time, if we have to stop the boats again, it'll be exponentially more difficult, and the media is absolutely culpable.
We might take one more question. 2 more questions.
Yes, it's quite amazing that Ian Rintoul, who was an advocate for open borders, was once a landlord with a property in Great Buckingham Street, where he used to police the downtrodden. Isn't that amazing? He's a graft. But the interesting, what I'd like to raise is, when you talk to these open border people, when you consider that there would be a minimum of 2 billion people who would leave their places of origin tomorrow, if they could, which of them will they deny access to? We could drive wages down to $2 an hour.
Well, you just look at Angela Merkel in Germany and the open border situation there, which has just been so destructive, so horrendous, and I don't know what Europe does. So
I can say I know for a fact that several of the people, the transferees on Manus are now in Austria. I know that for a fact. Because they send you Facebook requests.
I'd like to just add something. In this edition of The Economist, hang on. In this edition of The Economist has an article about refugees and how successful Germany's been integrating them into labour. How it's been achieved is that people who came from Spain and Greece and Italy, who couldn't get work in their own countries, have been denied access jobs in Germany so they can supply the refugees. That's how it's been done.
Judith.
I'm sorry I can't say his name. It starts with D.
Oh, the Iranian Jesus.
Yeah, that's right. He
yeah.
writes for The Guardian.
He writes for The Guardian. He's got a book coming out next month too.
I follow him all the time.
Yeah. It's kind of good.
I've had many debates with him. Have you met him?
Yeah, I have, and I have. Like, as in, he wasn't a direct. He was a behind-the-scenes player. He was never directly involved in any of the violence there. I knew who he was. I'd see him every day down at the beach, basically. I only ever had one that I can remember, like, actual conversation with him, and he creeped me out big time, so I used to avoid him. I got creeped out by him, yeah.
That's the face.
He was just creepy. He'd sit around, like, you'd see a picture of him, he used to call me Iranian Jesus just because of the persona he created, and he'd sit out at night on the beach in the wind looking out to the sea, singing in this really mournful, like, Persian song, and I just used to walk past and just go, it's just, this guy just creeps me out, and then I see him write for The Guardian all the time, and it's like, okay, whatever, dude.
The advocates use him for everything.
Yeah, he's the go-to. They made an animated movie about him, which is actually like real good. Like it's terrible, but it's really well made. The animation is just awesome. But like it portrays the riots in the start of 2014 in a completely farcical way. It makes it out like it's a scene out of Resident Evil or something. But so that's all just ridiculous. But it's actually a really well made movie, so I'd actually recommend everyone watch that if you want to get a weird idea. Just go on like YouTube or something on the internet. It's called like Nowhere Man, or just put in like Manus Island animated movie, it'll come up. It's like real well made, so I'll give them that. But it's just the most ridiculous portrayal of that riot that I've ever seen. Like, Yeah.
All right, we might draw to a close there. I just wanted, on behalf, we should all thank Miranda and Michael for
I think it's fair to say that most of us are aware that Michael Coates is not Michael's real name, and it's a shame, I think, that he feels that he needs to take on a persona.
That's not for me. That's more, as I mentioned before, with like advocates harassing families and that. I don't want my wife's business to be dragged through this. So it's not that far off my real name, so I don't really care. But
and I think we all should be indebted to people like Miranda who are prepared to go against the grain. It's the hardest thing to swim against the tide, to swim up and walk uphill. And Miranda, on behalf of us all, we do appreciate having people like you at that. Before I draw to a close, LibertyWorks does events all around the country. We have 2 others coming up in New South Wales, in Sydney. One which will be quite interesting and quite controversial is called A Jew, a Muslim and a Christian Walk into a Bar and Meet the Devil's Advocate. So keep an eye out for that. That'll be next month. Here in this very hotel on the 24th of May is also a social event called Liberty on the Rocks. There'll be lots of young people there. It's all about drinking beer. If you like beer, come along. Other than that, thank you very much for attending, and please stay to chat. Thank you.